And joining me now is former Republican National Committee Communications Director Doug Heye and former Democratic Congressman Steve Israel. So welcome both. Doug, which of these contenders do you think could better position her in swing states and might cause more problems?
I think it depends on what she wants to do, what direction she wants to go. Similar to the question that we would ask about Donald Trump when we were looking, is he going to select an African-American or a woman? As a Tar Heel, I certainly am fully behind Roy Cooper, my fellow UNC alumnus. But clearly, Josh Shapiro seems to have a lot of momentum for what he could potentially do in Pennsylvania. Mark Kelly with Arizona. Tim Walz could take it in a different direction as well. But one thing we should be mindful of, and I go back to North Carolina in 2004. I was working Richard Burr's Senate campaign when John Edwards was picked. I went to the first Kerry Edwards rally, which was in Raleigh. John Edwards didn't put that state into play for 5 minutes, and we sometimes overestimate, the chess pieces. If we do this, then this happens. It's going to be Kamala versus Trump more than JD versus whomever the vice
I agree
president picks.
completely with that. In fact, Roy Cooper has told some people, according to my reporting, that he doesn't think he could carry North Carolina. That said, Steve Israel, whom do you think that Harris should choose? You've watched all of this. You were famously very close to Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi, Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, they were concerned that they could lose the House, which they really had great confidence in getting, and that those vulnerable senators, the John Testers, others, would not have a chance with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, and now there's a fighting chance. So who would help her most in the important states?
Andrea, I spent a lot of time with my former colleagues in the House and Senate last week, and there's no question that the vibe is different. There is a vibe now. There's a sense that those down ballot races in the House and the Senate will be more competitive where they weren't before. I will say this. I think the choice is based on three very specific criteria. Number one, and most importantly, who is fit to lead and serve? And that has got to be the most important criteria. Number two, what value does the candidate bring to the ticket in those battleground states with those ticket splitters, those moderate voters? And number three, who can unify the party and also attract those ticket splitters in places like the suburbs of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, in Michigan, and elsewhere in Wisconsin, in Omaha, and elsewhere. So those are the criteria that you have to go through. And then one final point, I would say that the rollout of J.D. Vance is not what the Trump campaign expected. They had a strategy that was meant to pick J.D. Vance to accentuate the questions about Joe Biden's age. They ended up with a strategy that is accentuating questions about Donald Trump's age and fitness to serve. And so this has been a bit ironic in the political climate.
Ironic indeed. Doug, hi, let's talk about J.D. Vance, because those comments about childless cat ladies back when he was running for the Senate, and he had the chance to disavow them completely last week, and he did it awkwardly at best by saying he has nothing against cats in one of the interviews. The reaction among women and men, but among women and among people who either choose not to have children or have no choice but not to have children and try to have children.
The operative word is comments, plural. He didn't say this once. He said it repeatedly. And as you've seen so often in the GOP, there's an aping of Donald Trump's rhetoric and who can tweet and say the most outrageous thing to get booked on TV, to get clicks and so forth.
This was during his Senate campaign when he was trying to do exactly that and switch over from being an anti-Trumper. And he talked about people with children should have tax benefits over people who are childless, and they should have more votes.
Well, and that second part is sort of mind-blowing. The first part, that's actually current policy right now. There's a child care tax credit, and people who don't have children don't get that. But what we've seen so often is Republicans try to be Trump-like. They're not Donald Trump. For good or bad, they're not. And they're not going to be successful at saying crazy things that sort of don't get you in trouble. And one thing that was interesting to me was watching former Congressman Trey Gowdy before he had J.D. Vance on his show. And he talked about meeting Catholic nuns. Obviously, these are single women. And shout out to the Sisters of St. Joseph, who raised me in Catholic school in North Carolina. And he talked about the importance of what single women, what women or childless women or men for that matter contribute. And it came from Fox right before J.D. Vance came on, which is sort of a segue that you didn't expect and was really powerful. It gave J.D. Vance an opportunity to apologize and correct this, and he didn't.
And Steve Israel, how big a deal is this? Is this a quick, problem that'll go away, or is it a Quayle, Palin, Edwards problem?
Well, Sarah Palin was not a quick problem that went away because it cast doubt on John McCain's judgment. And by the way, John McCain was, I think, 6 years younger than Donald Trump is now when he made that choice. So these things don't go away. I think the line of this whole climate goes to Pete Buttigieg, who said that not since FDR chose his vice president in his last race has a presidential candidate's age and health been an issue, and J.D. Vance is no Harry Truman. I think that was the line of this climate.